Hello and welcome to the High Ground presented by TRICHOMES.com. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. On this episode, Jesse Betend talked to Matthew Ingram, CEO of Proof, a family-owned and operated cannabis company. Matthew talked about the journey his company has been on and what sets them apart from other cannabis companies. He also discusses how Proof is mission-driven and value-based, which translates into having a loyal team and how that benefits the consumer. Jesse and Matthew also talk about how important it is to work with the local community and how to stand out in the cannabis industry.
So we are officially recording, and let me just start by saying, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let's start with just, we were talking before we got started recording here, and you mentioned that there's a lot of terms, legacy, traditional, but I guess I just wanted to ask you, when you define the sort of journey that you and your company have been on, what words do you use to describe that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because the industry is constantly trying to define and redefine itself. And that's part of the fun joy of, it's a new industry in some senses. It's a new form of an old industry, I guess is probably a more accurate way of putting it. And so we're all trying to kind of figure things out as we go. Like, what do we call different facets of this industry? And that's part of what I love about it. But in terms of your question, when I think about Proof and what sets us apart and what I love about our company is that we're small, we're family owned and operated, we're bootstrapped, we're independent, we're values based, we're mission driven. Those are the kinds of things I focus on. And I'm often asked about this legacy or also called kind of traditional operator background, which I take to be defined as those who have been in business prior to a regulated environment. In other words, there weren't permits or licenses or other kinds of infrastructure available. Those who have been in business prior to those regulatory rollouts, and Proof is that kind of company. We have been in business prior to having a permit available and things. So I guess I would say that we're all of those things.
So I do think that that's really interesting, and even the fact that you sort of intimated that there was not necessarily like discomfort with the term, but maybe that you didn't necessarily associate with it 100%. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I guess I'm curious, a couple of things on that front. When someone talks about being a legacy operator, does that necessarily mean that they were operating illegally, or does that just mean that they were perhaps involved in the very early stages of pushing, who does that tend to include?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I actually really like these kinds of semantic discussions because, I don't know, I just find it, and it's important actually. I think the reason I like it is it's important because this industry, and specifically those who have been in the industry for a while, for let's say since pre-regulation, have gone through a lot and have risked a lot. And so I do think it's important that the industry recognize that and find words to describe those who predate regulated activity in the industry. And I want to recognize so really what I'm thinking about when I'm saying these words, which I'm realizing is kind of a word salad, because let me just say what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about having grown up where I did, which I moved around a lot, but I do think of Sonoma County, which is in Northern California, as my home, which is to say, like, I went to high school there and my community is there, and that's where Proof is based, and my kids have grown up there, and I grew up, a large part of my childhood was there. And just for context, Sonoma County in Northern California has had cannabis as part of the fabric of its community for generations. So folks think of Humboldt and maybe Mendocino and the Trinity, and there's a lot of these parts of California, and Sonoma is one of those for sure. So growing up as I did, I knew folks who were in and around the informal cannabis industry since childhood, and there was a particular one friend of mine whose house I used to go to quite often, and a good friend of mine. And his parents were outdoor growers back in the day. And I remember being there and remember being around the plants and remember being around the smells. And, it wasn't really that big of a deal until they got raided by CAMP, which is the paramilitary organization that used to fly around with black helicopters. I think it was the Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, I think is what it stood for. And they it was this sort of partnership with different agencies in collaboration with the state, and they would go out and raid folks. And so my friend's family farm was raided, and there were, of course, enormous consequences that came from that. So I think when I say, like, is Proof a legacy company, and part of this is having grown up around cannabis and actually really seeing the risks associated with cannabis. I actually shied away from it as a young professional, after
interesting.
high school. Yeah. And it was sort of like, I'd seen how real stuff got, back then. Huh. And I frankly, had seen enough of the risk play out. That I was sort of like, yeah, no, I think I'm going to do something else for a while. Of course, I obviously ended up back in cannabis, and I ended up back in cannabis prior to regulatory infrastructure, really. But so all by way of saying, when I think about folks who can sort of claim that label, if it's something that folks want to claim, there's levels of risk that people have tolerated or embraced that go back generations. And I really want to honor and respect that. And I really want to honor and respect those whose livelihoods were threatened. I mean, we have to talk about racial equity or inequity in this context, right? I mean, those who have really suffered as a result of the war on drugs are mostly not white men. They're mostly people of color, people who have been marginalized and who have been victimized by the war on drugs. So, let's let people claim that label themselves, I suppose, but let's definitely recognize the import of that, given the relative lack of risk that we all enjoy now. A lot of people had to lose a lot to get to where we are now.
That's a really, really good point. And, it kind of strikes me that, like, we don't necessarily use the same terms for somebody who, say, is currently serving a prison sentence for a cannabis conviction from a time before prohibition. Like, we don't call them legacy prisoners, right? And some states have done a good job of letting those people out and handling that. But the people who are, lucky enough to be able to operate in the new industry or in this new dynamic, in some ways, are lucky. So I want to talk a little bit about your step away and come back to cannabis, but let's just talk a little bit about the building of that industry. Where were you at in, I suppose was it Proof at the time, or were you not necessarily thinking about it as like a company prior to the foundation of an actual industry?
Yeah. So yeah, I remember. So I guess to back up a little bit. So I did, go to college after high school, and then went to graduate school, and then had a career in data analytics and healthcare and management. So my last job, for example, prior to starting Proof, was working for a pretty big health system. And I managed this big department. I think I had like 56 employees under me and several $1 million worth of a budget every year to deploy. And it was really amazing work. Actually, what I did was I managed the philanthropic programs for the hospital. So we had a number of free clinics, for example. So I had like a mobile medical clinic under my department and a dental clinic that was free for those who needed it. We gave grants away to other nonprofits. So an incredible job that I loved doing. But there had always been part of me that was interested in being an entrepreneur. And that goes back to, I really actually did that thing that entrepreneurs talk about, which is where they buy like the pack of Starburst at school and then sell each one for 25 cents.
Really?
I so distinctly remember being like, wow, that pack of Starburst ended up being worth a lot more when you parceled it out. I had that part of me. But I kind of went in this different direction. I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley, and I was studying econometrics. So I got 2 master's degrees, one in public health and one in public policy. So I was really focused on healthcare analytics and data around healthcare. And this was at the time when the Affordable Care Act was being crafted. So I was just really excited about being part of this positive change across the country. Yeah, focused on providing access to those who didn't have access to healthcare, health insurance. So that was where my head was. But as I kind of alluded to earlier, cannabis had always been part of the community in which I grew up, and actually had been a very direct part of my world. In other words, my friends and family members had been involved in cannabis for some time. So I was really familiar with the industry in some ways. And I think, as I said, there was a certain level of risk that I had seen when it was, going back to the 80s and 90s, but starting to see that there was a pathway for regulation that was being forged. At that time, we did not yet have a local ordinance, and we certainly didn't have state licenses available, but you could start to see that this was going to happen. And so I, made it, frankly, a pretty nutso move in retrospect of quitting that very stable, great job. I had young children at the time and benefits and all that, and jumped into starting a cannabis company. And the first step was to, we had to form the corporation and stuff, but really the first step was to find the space, because everything was about the space at the time. If you could find a space that was conducive to conducting business as a cannabis company, then that's kind of what you needed. And usually, I guess for a lot of folks, that just involved kind of not telling the landlord, but I wanted to set up a relationship with my landlord that they understood what I was trying to build. And that, you can imagine, like, it was so hard when you're like, hey, I'd like to start a company that is, like, I guess you could say, currently illegal. And are you interested in partnering with me on this? And by the way, I need really cheap rent because I don't have a lot of savings. And I had no investors, and I had no rich friends and no rich family members. And I don't come from money. And so it's like, I don't have much to offer, but let's try this. And I just remember driving around for months. I mean, literally driving around. I would work. I was consulting at the time, so I had left my prior job, but I was still doing related work independently. So I would do 4 hours of work in the morning, and then I would drive around in the afternoon looking at warehouse space. And I would just knock on the door and ask, "Are you the owner of the building? If not, who is the owner?" And I just would do that for months and months and months, and finally found the space. And that really was the genesis of what felt like could be a legal pathway. Yeah. So,
what were you looking for anything in particular? Sorry. Were you looking for anything in particular in those places, or just trying people at random?
Through friends and family members and others in the industry, my wife and I had landed on focusing on manufacturing. So we were really interested in the middle of the supply chain, because at the time, extraction was a pretty novel space. And so there was a lot of technological evolution. I mean, even still, but there was just so much new technology. There was so much new opportunity around processing and how to process in different ways. So that's what we wanted to focus on. So we were looking at a relatively small warehouse where we could start a manufacturing company, and we were going to essentially focus on extraction. So we would, procure biomass and transform it into oil. So I didn't need a lot of space. So I found a landlord who amazingly was open to that, totally transparent, cannabis lease, even though there was no ordinance at the time. And then over the years, we were able to line it up entirely. He supported our application to the county. And we were able to line that up with local and state regulations.
Wow, that's really interesting that you went ahead and you found it important to be honest with your landlord, because I think we've all heard stories about sort of antagonistic relationships between even licensed legal businesses and people that perhaps own their land, or that they're leasing land from, or their neighbors not liking it, or the neighborhood having a problem with it. And this is a difficult thing for the industry. Wherever you're deciding to operate, you kind of have to work with the local framework, and in some cases those local areas, municipalities, whatever, have quite a bit of power to say no. So I want to focus a little bit though on the risk that you mentioned involved. I mean, you had to take a risk being honest with this person and operating in the way that you did. How much risk were you kind of taking at this point? And given your firsthand knowledge of, what is potentially at stake in these kinds of situations, why do you think that you were open to it?
Yeah, another great question, because there's this huge spectrum of risk. And I want to give credit to my wife and partner and co-founder. And so my wife, Julie Mercer Ingram, is a cannabis compliance attorney. And right around then was transforming all of her legal practice into cannabis, being totally focused on cannabis compliance. So I would say that there was risk because, again, there was not really a regulatory framework to operate a cannabis business. There was also some basic sort of sets of, I don't want to call them rules, but there were some guidelines from the state. And I'm talking about the collective model. So you could have a collective, you could sign people into your collective. There were certain procedures that you followed regarding how to bring people into your collective. You were allowed to operate within the constraints of that collective. So each patient, as they were called, could have, a certain, I'm thinking about cultivation. You could cultivate a certain number of plants, but in manufacturing, you could have a certain number of grams of oil. So yes, there was risk for sure. I mean, I do remember driving around to source trim for extraction, and I had this like binder full of my collective agreements in the car, which is really the best you could do at the time. But it really depended on like where you were that moment. If you got pulled over in one town, they would probably understand and be okay with the collective. And if you had documents, they'd want to look at them and review them, but I think they would understand them. In other towns, they were absolutely not at all friendly to cannabis. In fact, they were looking, I think to crack down on those who were trying to find a way to operate. So there was, I would say that there was risk at the time. And I, again, as the father of two young kids and stuff, I'm really pleased that we were able to find a way that we could formalize, that experience. So when we got to the place, I remember when we paid our first cannabis taxes. In fact, we were the first entity to pay the cannabis tax.
That's right.
Yeah. So it was just like such an amazing moment to give, I've grown to feel a little bit less excited about paying government taxes. And this industry is so brutal, but I was so excited to be like, here we are, like out in the open entirely. Everyone knows our name and our company and our address, and we're paying you taxes. That felt like a great moment. I think though, what really defined proof with that experience was that because, like I said, I come from certainly very middle class. I would say lower middle class background. My dad is an artist and taxi driver. My mom was an educator, a parent, a caregiver. We just didn't have a lot of money, and the same background applied, frankly, to proof, which is to say that we were forced to do everything super smartly and work very, very hard and be very efficient because we did not have the luxury of funding. We didn't seek funding. We weren't thinking about things in that way, but probably more importantly, because everything was on the line, as a family, as a company, we put everything on the line to make sure that this thing worked. So there was never really an option that it wouldn't, and that's still totally, actually, to be honest, is still totally the way that we operate. We still have never accepted funding. We've never solicited funding. We have never gone out there and said, please give us money to help our company grow. We've always found the way to do it ourselves. And that's made us so much more resilient, so much stronger, so much more creative. I remember a moment where I actually this is very early on, like the first 3-4 months of business. I went to a contact and said, I presented them with an opportunity. I remember, I'll just share the details because it's kind of funny at the time. I was asking them to give us $100,000 and in exchange, we were going to give them 10% of the company. And I remember he was like, let's be reasonable. In other words, like, you're not being reasonable, which is funny because that would have been a great deal for them. They should have done it. But the point is, if we had gotten that $100,000, I think that the way I would have spent that at the time would have been kind of dumb. Like, I feel like we would have made some bad decisions around equipment we would have purchased, business decisions that we would have made that really wouldn't have driven the company forward. And it was the scarcity that ended up creating, this really resilient, very lean, just tough company. And so I wouldn't do it any other way in retrospect.
Yeah, that was kind of where I was going next. You mentioned being sort of self-funded and bootstrapped, and that as a small business, I assume that gives you a certain amount of freedom or ability to operate independently in a way that perhaps these larger corporations can't. You touched on a lot of the things that are perhaps benefits, but talk a little bit about, why should a consumer perhaps care about that sort of side? Does that actually end up creating a better product or a better experience for the people who are, purchasing products in the industry?
That is such an awesome question. I'm so glad you asked that because it's something I talk about, like when I'm out, doing education with Betenders or something. I'll say we're family owned, we're bootstrapped, and I often think like, do they care? And then I realize that, because for me it's been such an important theme to our story, but from an outsider, is it something they should be thinking about? But actually, it so is, because the fact that we are independent and that we're bootstrapped and that we've been able to be completely family owned and operated has allowed us to make decisions that are in the interest of our stakeholders, but maybe wouldn't be in the interest necessarily only of the shareholders if we had them who had that kind of power. So, for example, we make some products that are extremely valuable from a medical perspective, but are low margin. And I am so happy to do that. We will do that. We will continue to do that because people derive real benefit. And we hear these anecdotes all the time, whether it's our sales team, whether it's me directly, whether we just hear them come in all the time that we make products that are changing people's lives. And of course, we're running a business. We're not running a nonprofit. So we make sure that we have a great overall margin, but there are going to be some products that we will commit to putting out there because they have real benefit and we'll make money on them, but maybe we wouldn't make as much as some other product. Another example would be that we give our entire full-time team full benefits, vision, life, dental. We don't mess around with benefits. And when we brought those on, that was not financially a good decision. If we had a real CFO at the time who was there trying to make sure that we were staying in line with our financial goals, that person would have been like, no, dude, that's insane. What are you doing? But it made sense because we're a values-based company and we're a mission-driven company. And I think that there are investors who understand that and actually see the value in that, for sure. I don't mean to imply that there aren't. But what I do mean is that we've been able to be incredibly nimble and flexible. And so for a consumer, that shows up in the products, as I mentioned, but it also shows up in how we operate overall. So to give a third example, the fact that we have been able to be values-based and mission-driven means that we have a really loyal, very high caliber, incredible team. And what that means is that we don't miss deliveries. We don't run into back orders. Our menu is complete and our deliveries get there on time because our team is so incredible. And so ultimately that benefits the consumers because they're getting access to their medicine or their product as they want, as they need them. But it really comes back to the fact that we've been able to build the kind of culture and kind of environment that I think again that the scarcity has produced. If that makes sense.
It does. And not to imply that a larger corporation necessarily doesn't do this, but does it allow you to perhaps be more receptive or responsive in some ways to the needs of your customers where they could actually kind of reach out and communicate in some way that a product is working for them or that they have an issue with a particular product? And it seems to me that there's kind of a benefit in being able to perhaps reach somebody if you need somebody.
Yeah, there's I'd say they're just thinking back to even the past week, there's two ways that shows up specifically. So one would be that because we don't have like a large, marketing or education team. So I actually love to do a lot of the Betender and other employee educations myself. So now with Zoom or previously in person, I would go out throughout the state and meet with staff and tell them about Proof. And what that did is it created a venue for conversation. And so over the past, certainly 18 months, but going back even earlier, all of the new products that Proof releases come directly from our partners in the retailers, whether it's the Betenders passing on customer feedback or whether it's others who have the expertise and they see like, hey, you guys have this product line. I think there's one part missing from it. I really suggest you go ahead and do that. So the fact that I'm personally out there, I think just creates less friction there. We may hear that same kind of feedback if we had a very large corporate funded team, but it just hits differently when I'm able to have that conversation, and really hear directly from the staff about other kinds of products that our customers are asking for. And then the other thing I would say is that I talk directly to our customers all the time because we're so small. If they call and leave a message, which just happened recently, a patient called dealing with cancer, and they left a message on our voicemail about, our products and trying to understand how they could help. And I called that person back, which I always do when there's these kinds of situations because I enjoy having those conversations. So, being a small company creates that kind of dialogue between us and our customers that is so helpful to us in terms of where and how we develop. And I think also hopefully it's helpful to our customers. And I do think there's lots of great big, venture funded or otherwise large funded companies that maybe have built that kind of mechanism, and props to them for doing that. But that's just part of our ethos, that we have that real open, transparent mode for communication.
So I guess the last question that I kind of wanted to ask, and it leads into it well, is, we are in a moment right now where the industry is kind of small, and because of licensing, perhaps customers don't have as much choice. But I assume that that's something that will change over time as the industry grows. Customers will have more and more options. So how do you think about differentiating your products? It sometimes seems, and like as someone who reads a lot of like press releases about products or something like that, you kind of see like a lot of the same words and stuff like that. Like, how do you think about standing out in this industry and continuing to stand out? What's the best method of communicating that efficacy to people that are interested in your products?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple sides to that. There's our presentation, meaning like the words that we use and the way that we look. Again, to give credit where it's due to my wife and partner, co-founder Julie, when we first started Proof, she was really adamant that we needed to look and feel approachable so that people of all different kinds, different ages, different races and ethnicities, different genders could walk into a store and feel that our brand was approachable and that they wanted to pick up the box and learn more about us. And the context there is that at the time, I think cannabis largely really was fairly kind of narrowly targeted. People were thinking about a certain kind of consumer, and they were really missing a lot of the others. So we created a way of presenting ourselves that felt and looked like, okay, this is something that's interesting and I want to learn more about. And I think on the product level itself, the thing that we do, again, because we are small and bootstrapped and we're sort of hungry in this way, is that we rely on really word of mouth. So if our product doesn't work exceptionally well, our company won't work because we really have a very minimal advertising and marketing budget. So every time we're making a product, we're like, this better really achieve exactly what folks are hoping it achieves. And so there's a lot of pressure on that. So I think we differentiate by being, we're known for being, for example, very high potency, whether that's on the CBD or THC side or both. And the reason for that is that we want our products to work. To the extent that we've been allowed to have medical research on cannabis in this country, which is to a minimal extent, but it is quite clear that, these sort of low potency products that I see on the market are just not going to be helpful for people, whether it's for a specific acute medical treatment like cancer, or whether it's for generalized, anxiety relief or sleeplessness or those kinds of things. So we differentiate our products really on the basis of their efficacy. And that's very, very intentional, again, because that's our company's built on that kind of viral word of mouth success.
Matthew Ingram is the CEO and co-founder of Proof. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I just want to say that, you mentioned that your company's small and that in some ways allows you to take risks. And I would definitely include among those risks your habit of sort of seemingly being transparent and open and honest with, whether that was your landlord early on, consumers today. I salute that. And I think that, it is a risk. You're taking a risk by doing that. But I think that it ultimately is what consumers want.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I have learned in the course of this experience and in life overall, I suppose, to be ourselves, and Proof is very authentic and very genuine, and that's reflected in the whole culture of the team. So I appreciate you recognizing that. And yeah, we're going to continue to be ourselves and keep kind of rocking it. And we've really seen that actually folks see that and understand that.
We want to thank Matthew Ingram of Proof again for taking the time to talk to us. You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share, please reach out. You can reach the show at highground at TRICHOMES.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com and following us on all social media. For TRICHOMES.com, I'm producer David Fortin. Thank you for listening, and be well.